Today, a chartered aircraft carrying a Uruguayan rugby team has been found 72 days after it went down in the
ha
Andes.
sido encontrado hoy tras 72 días.
All of the passengers were given up for dead.
Habían sido dados por muertos.
Ayer, dos
Two
supervivientes.
survivors of the crash stumbled into a small town in Chile yesterday.
Un helicóptero ha sido enviado esta mañana.
This morning, a helicopter has been sent to recover another 14 survivors still in the mountains.
It has already been labeled one of the most incredible survival stories in recent
Se
times.
dice que es una de las más increíbles historias de supervivencia de todos los tiempos.
Será conocido para siempre como el milagro de los Andes.
It will be forever known as the miracle in the Andes.
Theatricality and deception. Powerful agents to the uninitiated. But we are initiated.
I'm super excited!
On today's episode, we will be focusing on the unbelievable true story filled with tragedy, friendship, hope, and cannibalism. It's a tale involving life, death, and survival, including all the hardship, determination, and devotion with the will to survive. The crash in the Andes, the incredible true story of Flight 571, the rugby team that fell from the sky. It's the plane crash that shook the world with disgust, but yet understanding, hidden within the tale that holds back dark secrets that surrounds the whole subject itself. What's up, you guys? It's your late night into the AM conspiracy theorist with the best conspiracy theories on any social media platform. That's right, Conspired Deception. Oh yeah. You've stumbled upon the only channel that climbs to the highest parts of the untraveled earth. Swim through the deepest depths of the ocean, and discover uncharted territories as we travel through space and time, just to bring you this brand new special event.
Welcome to Jurassic Park.
Wait a minute, that's not right. Welcome to Conspired Deception Official. And welcome to Forgotten History, the only series that unearths history's buried secrets. This series is chock full of little bits of information, stories, and historic events that you need to know before the silent history is buried and forgotten about with the passing of time. Now, I had to dig deep on this story. After months and months of research, hundreds of videos, thousands of newspaper articles, and eyewitness testimonies from survivors in connection with books, interviews, and even a movie, I can promise you that you will never find a more exciting depiction that is connected with all the information in one place. Usually, the information is split up individually, spread out through each episode, offering a piece of the story over here and a little bit more information of the story over there. The events of the story is mostly watered down and censored for the viewer's sake. But not here. Here at Conspired Deception, we will explore all the gruesome details entwined with this miserable and agonizing event. Viewer discretion is highly advised. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that little ringy-dingy thing for more informational content, backed with truth, facts, and conspiracies. On October 13, 1972, a plane carrying 45 passengers, including an entire professional rugby team, crashed in the Andes Mountains between Chile and Argentina. There was no way that the survivors could have known at the time, but their nightmare had just begun for what was left of Flight 571. So join me for a minute. Let's jump into our imaginary time machine, hit the accelerator to 88 miles per hour, and let's go back in time. Ooh, yeah, that's just a little bit too far back. Oopsie! Let's jump back into our imaginary time machines and move forward. The 70s. According to the American history books, the United States were in the middle of getting rid of their president at the time, Richard Nixon, because of the whole Watergate scandal. And Chile, which is the exact place we're talking about right now in this video, had their government overthrown. Also making the news, which I don't remember reading about at all in the American history books during school, by the way, according to the article, also making news, like it wasn't important enough to be the main story, but the Olympic massacre where people were killed and held hostage. The Vietnam War was coming to a close, but we still face things like energy crisis and inflation. Now, our story takes place in Montevideo, Uruguay. It was a beautiful spring day in the capital city of Krakow, a well-to-do neighborhood just 20 minutes away from downtown. Members of the local Christian rugby team were getting ready to fly to Santiago, Chile for a soccer match and a 5-day vacation. The old Christian rugby team was one of the biggest rugby union teams in Uruguay. With 18 league titles, they clinched more domestic trophies than all but one team in the country. The team went on to have several players represented in the national championship by the end of their first decade. They were always battling for the top position, and they remained first in the championship. Around 6:30 a.m., the boys finished packing the last of their belongings for the trip. Most of the team were heavy smokers, so they made sure to bring more than enough cigarettes to last the whole trip because of the shortage in socialist Chile. The boys' ages varied from the early 20s all the way down to 18 years old. And in order to make the trip affordable, the team has chartered a plane from the Uruguayan Air Force, and they had sold their extra tickets to friends and family members. Nando, a member of the team, his mother, and 18-year-old sister, Susanna, were accompanying him on the trip. Another member, 19-year-old Robert Canessa. Canessa was in his second year of medical school. He has earned the nickname Muscles, both because of his physical strength and his headstrong nature. The year before, the team had already visited Chile concerning a previous match, and everything had gone smoothly. The 832-mile trip would have taken them more than 20 hours to drive by road, so the team decided to splurge by chartering a twin-turbo jet Fairchild FH-227D, a plane belonging to the Uruguayan Air Force. It came equipped with a crew of servicemen and its own pilots. The pilot had 5,117 flying hours to his name, including 29 flights across the Andes. The Fairchild had a shocking safety record. Out of 78 of their 227 Fairchilds produced, 23 of them had been in accidents resulting in 393 total fatalities. That's 1/3 of their fleet that has met their untimely end. And this particular aircraft that the team has rented was only 4 years old. The boys, their friends, and family members boarded the Fairchild. Because the weather in Chile is warm, the boys have packed lightly. They have dressed in short-sleeved t-shirts, shorts, and maybe even a sports jacket or two. The plane left the boys' hometown. They were excited to make the trip through the Andes. The 19 players were alongside 21 friends and family members, with 5 crew members. Making the subtotal count for the attendance, 45 people total aboard the plane. It was a joyful atmosphere as the boys celebrated, and they knew that it would be an unforgettable trip. Little to their knowledge, this experience would leave them fighting for their very survival and lead them down a path so dark that it would leave them emotionally damaged and scarred forever. Due to the storm over the Andes Mountains, Flight 571 was forced to land in Mendoza, Argentina, and spend the night to outwait the storm. The boys spent a quiet night in the city just 100 miles away from their planned destination, the last comfortable and relaxing night they would have for a while. By the next day, the weather had not changed, but they didn't want to delay their trip any longer. Although the storm over the Andes have not improved, the pilots decide that their aircraft will be able to manage the crossing. When the boys arrived at the airport, they joked about boarding on the most unluckiest day of the year, Friday the 13th. With pressure from the crew and passengers, the pilot had a very important decision to make. He could take the direct route to Santiago, which is only 122 miles away. But this would have been very tricky because the route reached elevations of nearly 26,000 feet. The plane's maximum was 28,000 feet. He was also training a new pilot, so the pilot decided to go with the safer route, flying south, where they could cross at the lower altitude. The 576-mile journey would take about an hour and 30 minutes. The plane takes off from the airport, and the pilots had to rely upon a combination of radio navigation and dead reckoning. So the Fairchild heads west to Chile. The pilot radios into Santiago's air traffic control reporting that the plane has passed a small town in Chile on the western edge of the mountains. What no one knows is that the pilot is badly mistaken. In fact, the plane is still in the middle of the Andes, which is hidden away by a thick bank of clouds. The signals are weak, making the navigational instruments on the control panel highly inaccurate. As the pilot claimed they were heading north, he received permission to drop 11,500 feet in altitude for the final stretch to the airport. As they began their descent, it had become clear that something was very wrong. As the pilot lowers the Fairchild, they hit extreme turbulence that shakes the plane violently. The plane fought desperately to regain control, but fear quickly turned to horrors. They broke through the clouds and found out that the pilot had incorrectly judged their destination and location, and they were still in the Andes Mountains. Flying over the Andes Mountains can be very dangerous. Experienced pilots know to fly in the morning because by the afternoon, the mixture of hot and cold air can cause cyclone-like winds. Soon the flight attendants announced that they would be landing shortly. In fact, in the last few minutes, the crew acted as if nothing was going on and everything was fine. Moments before the descent, Canessa switched his seat to a seat next to him, trading places with the boy because it was his first time flying and he wanted to see what the mountain scenery had to offer. Canessa recalls the boy next to him asking, "Aren't we flying too close to the mountains?" In fact, the plane's wingspan reached only 10 feet away from the mountains at that moment. Seconds later, his questions were answered, and his fear was recognized. Realizing what was about to happen, the co-pilot tilted the plane in nearly full vertical, which caused the plane to stall. At this point, they had no chance to avoid the collision that followed. The engine sputtered and the plane descended. People started preparing for the worst. Prayers were heard throughout the cabin as they were about to brace for impact.
The Catholic, we have 3 normal players. I say, if I choose the longest, I won't finish it. If I choose the little one, it's too short. And so I choose the Hail Mary because it's on the middle.
I remember someone say, "Jesus, Jesus, don't leave me." And Carlitos was praying Hail Mary, and I was waiting just for the final moment.
Then came the crashing sound. It began to flip and it severed the tail of the plane. The aircraft struck the mountains with tremendous force as the pilots were still trying to gain altitude. The right wing had been struck off by the collision of hitting the mountain, and it broke it from the fuselage, immediately sucking out the stewardess, navigator, and one other passenger. Shortly after, the left wing was ripped off, and the propeller sliced through the body of the aircraft. The seats of the plane was eventually launched forward, and Nando was knocked unconscious. This action caused 2 passengers to be flung out of the aircraft as well. The plane fell from the sky, and everyone expected to smash into the mountains at any moment. But instead, the fuselage did a belly flop in a valley, causing the plane to slide down the mountain like a bomb sled. And the plane was again launched forward toward the cockpit, like a roll of dominoes, before coming to a sudden, jarring stop. It finally came to a halt after colliding with a snowbank. The plane came to rest at 11,500 feet in the valley between Chile and Argentina. The plane crashed in the part of the Andes so remote that there was no name of the area at the time. The crash itself was a bloody chaos. 7 people were immediately thrown from the plane during the crash, including the team's only licensed doctor, and their bodies were nowhere in sight. Dr. Robert Canessa would eventually write in his book, I Had to Survive. In it, he explains exactly what he felt after the plane had hit the mountains. He reported that his body was launched forward upon impact, and he immediately struck his head. His first thought was that his life was about to end, and he began to pray. Someone nearby yelled, "Please, God, help me, please, don't leave me," while other voices shouted that they were blind or injured in some way. When Canessa looked at the screaming blind passenger, he saw that the man's brains were literally spilling out of his head. The planes were left in ruins, and they crashed in the middle of a blizzard. The smell of jet fuel and gas and the sounds of screaming filled the air. The crash had split the fuselage from the rest of the aircraft, and it was wide open. The rugby team, along with their friends and family members, found themselves stranded and surrounded by snow-capped mountains. And when it was all finally over, 12 people had already perished, and 33 were alive with injuries ranging from minor to severe. 19-year-old teammate Canessa and Zambino were second and first-year medical students, and they tried to help evaluate the situation to help the wounded as much as they could with the experience they had. 75 miles away in Santiago, air traffic controllers loses contact with the Fairchild. Their first call is to the Chilean Aerial Rescue Service.
When the plane does not arrive in Santiago, the Chilean Air Force launches a search and rescue mission.
Initially, an investigation into a crash should be based on a flight path. The search begins at the last known point and works backward from there.
The older boy said, "Carlitos, don't worry. We'll be rescued soon." I believed what they told me.
Carlitos' father is the first family member to arrive at the rescue headquarters in Chile.
I knew that there was no way that my son Carlitos would fail me when we'd had so many adventures together and been so close.
A famous painter at home in Uruguay, Carlos has crossed the continent to find his son.
Hello, Commander Mas.
Carlos Páez, desde el primer momento.
From the beginning, Carlos Páez had the drive, courage, and determination to find his son.
Massa takes the unusual step of allowing Carlos to take part in the search flights.
We spent hours circling the mountains. I prayed for my son with tears in my eyes, not knowing if it was from the pain of the search or the reflection of the snow.
Marcelo, age 25, was the captain of the rugby team, and he had assumed the leadership position as they tried to evaluate the situation and extract the people from the wreckage. Nando, age 22, had been knocked unconscious and seemed near dead. His mother had been crushed to death, and Nando's sister Susana, age 20, although still alive, had sustained serious injuries and was bleeding rapidly from her head. The boys placed Nando in a pile with the dead corpses just outside the fuselage, thinking he was dead. Nando was not dead. He was just in a coma. Apparently, the hypothermia from being placed into the snow while in a coma was in fact the very thing that kept him alive. One of the teammates, 22-year-old Rafael, has had his calf torn from his leg bone, and it was wrapped around his shin. Zambino promptly put the calf flesh back in place and wrapped it with a t-shirt. Another one of the boys sees that Zambino is acting as medical help. He approaches him with a steel tube sticking out of his stomach. Zambino is chill, tells him not to worry, that he'll be fine, and just come help with the injured. As the boy leaned in, Zambino put his knee against his chest and pulled the steel tube out, along with 6 inches of intestines. Zambino gave him a little pep talk to continue. The teammate agrees and stuffs his insides back inside of himself and wraps it with a t-shirt. Canessa makes his way through the fuselage to the cockpit. The pilot was the most important person for the boys to get rescued and off this mountain. They thought he might know where they were. The co-pilot had died directly on impact, and the pilot was still alive, but critically injured. The control panel had impaled into the pilot and embedded in his chest. He was delirious with pain, and he insisted that the aircraft has passed through the mountains and was on the western edge of the mountains. The pilot begged for his gun that he had brought in his luggage so that he could end his misery. But the boys, being with the Catholic religion, denied his request, but fed him snow to keep him hydrated. Canessa checked the radio in the instrument panel, but it was dead. Dead, but not broken. New reports about the missing plane flashes across the South Americans' mainstream media. Chilean Search and Rescue is in charge of finding the flight, and search lasted until the night began to set in. Little did the rescue team know that they were flying incredibly close to the site of the crash. So close, in fact, the survivors could actually see the rescue planes. But the rescue planes could not see them. Unfortunately, the plane's white fuselage blended in with the snowy white mountains and could not be spotted from the air. Fog from the storm didn't make things any easier.
The Chilean Air Force searches along the scheduled flight path, but finds nothing.
Convinced that the rescue mission would arrive within hours, the boys took their suitcases and arranged them to make a cross on the ground. And they believed that it would be easily visible. They also used their footsteps to carve an SOS message in the snow. for the planes that might be flying overhead. The boys all were forced into rugby at a young age. Through it, they learned respect and discipline for others and the concept of teamwork. In the Andes, they created a community of solidarity. Everything they had up there was shared with everyone else. The rugby education and character formation was extremely important to them to ensure their common objective. And at this moment, their main objective was to survive. The mild, warm climate in their hometown left them completely unprepared for the freezing temperatures. For many of them, this was the first time they had ever seen snow in their entire life. The survivors came to the grim realization that they would have to spend the night stranded 1,000 miles from civilization with no means of contacting rescuers. Night set in, and there was nothing for the survivors to do but bundle up in the fuselage to try and get some sleep. But the fuselage acted as a freezing icebox, with barely any room to stand, let alone sit down comfortably. Some of the boys attempted to build a wall made out of empty suitcases and seats torn from the aircraft to block out the wind. But it was no match for the wind ripping through every crack that had been brought on from the damage. The survivors huddled together and hold hands and cuddle up to stay warm. Some of the boys used their armpits to warm up their hands. As night continued, the boys had to hit each other to keep their circulation going. When their circulation started to slow down, the boys began to feel pain in their bones. This was a sign of their skin beginning to freeze, showing every stages of hypothermia.
Immediate danger for the survivors is hypothermia, which can occur when the body is exposed to cold. As their body temperatures drop, blood vessels close to the surface of the skin constrict, reducing blood flow to the extremities. This preserves the body's core temperature, protecting the vital organs. Continued exposure reduces nerve and motor functions. Heart rate and breathing decreases. Slowly, the body shuts down.
You begin to feel the pain in your bones more than in your skin. And you think, well, I'm going to die and I'm going to freeze and that's it.
People were crazy, shouting, many people dying, freezing.
They didn't have much, but what little they did had, they found use for. They took the covers of the seat cushions and used them as blankets. The night creeped in by so slow. Zambino thought he saw daylight after what felt like hours of torture, only to look at his watch and realize that it was 9 p.m. A middle-aged woman that had bought a last-minute ticket so that she could attend her daughter's wedding was trapped under a pile of seats with her 2 broken legs pinned underneath. The boys tried to help her, but as they lifted the very seats that pinned her down, she would start crying out of pain, claiming that they were trying to kill her. Her screams of agonizing pain was so awful that it kept everyone up overnight. Some of them begged for her to stop. Some even got angry and shouted, telling the woman to just shut up and go to sleep. Later, Canessa looked into the woman's face. Her breathing stopped, her eyes rolled into the back of her head, and she died. Lying in the snow, just outside of the plane, Nando clings to life. One of the boys spotted him still breathing. Realizing he is alive, he drags Nando back into the fuselage. The cries of the agonizing pain continued through the night.
At 4,000 meters, temperatures outside can drop as low as minus 40 degrees Celsius at night. Their only hope is to be rescued.
The first night was horrible. People screaming, people dying, the cold, very brutal cold. For many of us, it was the first time we had seen a dead person.
By the next morning, several injured people had died throughout the night, including the middle-aged woman and the pilot. 5 people total had perished. Out of the 45 original passengers, only 28 are still alive and still remaining hopeful. They began to search the luggage for anything useful that they could use. They had to evaluate their living situation for a moment. There was nothing to do but try and make the fuselage more livable. Throughout the day, they continued to pull the dead bodies out of the plane. The environment was starting to already take its toll on the survivors. The early signs of frostbite has now blackened the extremities of the injured. From the injured who couldn't keep moving to stay warm. They thought Nando's sister Susanna was dead, but when another body was moved off from on top of her, she cried out that her feet hurt, saying, "Mama, Mama, oh please, Mama, can't we go home? 35-year-old Liliana Methal was a breath of fresh air for the boys. She was on board with her husband, and she was a cousin to one of the rugby players. And she quickly became a source of comfort and mother-type figure. She wouldn't accept any special treatment and would sleep in the worst, coldest parts of the plane. Now, what about the rescue flares? What about the radio to call for help? What the passengers learned from the only surviving crew member, a mechanic named Carlos. And between his fits of weeping and losing control of his bodily functions, he claimed that there were no flares, and the radio might need batteries. And so there was hope. If they could locate the tail portion of the plane, which was in a totally different unknown location on the mountain, and get the batteries out of there, then they might be able to get the cockpit radio working and call for help. Marcelo, the team's captain, inventoried the food and drinks. Among the debris, they found 1 tin of salted almonds, 1 peach jam, 1 apple jam, 1 blackberry jam, 3 bottles of wine. The other 5 bottles had been consumed that night. 2 bottles of whiskey, 1 bottle of brandy, a half a flask of brandy, 8 chocolate bars, 5 nougat bars, a few caramels, a few dates, a few dried plums, 1 packet of salted biscuits, and 2 tins of mussels. At this time, there were still 28 total survivors that needed fed. So they gathered up what they could with the current luggage surrounding them, and they rationed out their food. Marcelo gave everyone a square piece of chocolate and a deodorant cap full of wine each day. And by the evening, the survivors heard both a jet and a small plane fly over them. They even saw the small plane tilt its wing, a sign of air communication that the pilot had seen the survivors. This excited the boys. Feeling sure that a rescue was on the way, Canessa was so happy that he and a few others started chugging bottles of wine and even ate some of the food to celebrate. They even tried to signal for help by writing SOS on the top of the plane by using blood from the dead bodies and the injured. Reports claimed that they used lipstick found in the luggage. But let's be real here. There was not enough women on board to provide the lipstick for a message to be written and seen from the sky. As the evening began to set in, no one came. The survivors had to face the cold-hearted truth that no one was coming to save them tonight. Decisions and arrangements ensured over whether or not that they could count on being rescued. Captain Marcelo was especially enraged over the 2 candy bars and the bottles of wine that had been consumed during the celebration. Nando, the boy left for dead in the snow, unexpectedly started to recover, while his sister's condition only worsened. Team Captain Marcelo organized people into work groups. The cabin boys were the youngest boys, and their job was to lay out the cushions that they used to sleep in, blankets, and seat covers to dry in the sun. Canessa eventually strung up some makeshift hammocks, made of straps, poles, and luggage compartment webbing. The severely injured Rafael, the guy with the flayed calf situation, and the team's best kicker, who had 2 broken legs, basically took up residence in the hammocks. Walking around the deep snow wasn't easy. They also dismembered all the wool seat covers and stuffed them inside the little bits of clothing to add installation. The boys also found a small battery-powered transistor radio. It was a major discovery. They could now listen to the news and keep track of the search. That evening, 2 days after the crash, Nando regains consciousness, and he learns that his mother is dead and his sister is dying. He quickly embraced her in his arms, where they both would remain for days.
Susie was my younger sister. We always got along very well. When I realized that my sister was in the front section of the fuselage, she became my priority. The only thing I could do for her was to keep her warm by hugging her.
Although surrounded by snow, Nando and the others suffer from dehydration.
The thirst at that altitude is exactly the same as the one you can feel in the middle of the desert, in the Sahara. You dehydrate a lot faster than at sea level.
Dehydration happens when a person's breathing rate increases. To get sufficient oxygen from the thin atmosphere, Nando must breathe more quickly. which expends more moisture than normal. What Nando and the others don't realize is that eating snow also robs the body of valuable energy and heat and accelerates the process of hypothermia. Ingesting snow rapidly cools the mouth, and when it's swallowed, the cold water lowers the body's temperature. To restore warmth to the mouth and body, valuable heat and energy is expended.
With no protection from the cold and wind, your lips start to break and bleed. And if you put snow in your mouth, it hurts a lot. It was a double torture, the thirst plus the pain of putting snow on your destroyed lips. But there was no other way.
Carlitos tries to melt snow by shaking it, but it burns valuable energy and proves exhausting.
The solution came about when someone discovered a way to make water.
They developed a life-saving method for melting snow into drinking water. This was to become one of the primary chores of the survivors. They had to find fresh snow and not dirty, bloody, urine, oil-filled snow that surrounded the crash site. They built a funnel with the metal sheet that they had found to exist under every passenger's seat. The snow would take 2 to 3 hours to melt into water from the sun and drip down to fill the empty wine bottle. And the remaining survivors faced another huge problem. They only had 3 pairs of sunglasses between them, which you would think would be a non-issue in their situation, but apparently there is such thing called snow blindness. It's when the bright sunlight reflects off of the white snow and straight into your eyes. Because of this, they were forced to get even more creative, and they improvised their own sunglasses. They fabricated them out of plastic from the pilot's cabin, wires, and bra straps. The 4th day on the mountain didn't bring much hope, and the survivors have now ran out of their food supply.
The last thing I ate was a peanut covered in chocolate. I made it last for 3 days.
Eating has become their main topic of the conversation. Nando begins to talk to them about trying to rescue themselves. He found himself almost alone on the thought of action, with almost everyone else being opposed to the idea, still having high hopes of a rescue. As they begin to discuss the idea of venturing out, one of the boys told Nando he'd never make it on foot. He stated, "You don't even have enough strength from the lack of food," continuing that their bodies remain too weak for the long unknown expedition. Nando responds, "Then I'll cut out the meat from one of the dead pilots. After all, they're the ones who got us into this mess." The boys laughed, thinking that his determination was just talk, and he was just delusional from his head injury. A devastating thought emerged among the survivors. Most of the boys, including the team captain, Marcelo, believed that hope and God would come to their rescue and that he would not abandon them or leave them in the mountains. The intense optimism was understandably the more popular theory for the group of the boys, but there was a small group of people who felt that they needed to face how dire the situation really was. Canessa and Nando, alongside with a few others, believed that most of the survivors had a case of what could be called toxic positivity. The positivity was a result of living in denial, but leaving for help also seemed near impossible. The pains of hunger started to take control. The boys tried everything they could to find anything that they could eat.
I say, Adolfo, Nando is crazy. He wants to eat the pilot. And Adolfo told me he's not crazy, and we were thinking the same thing.
A few of the boys tried to eat leather by tearing off straps of the seats and luggage, but it caused them to get sick because leather contains deadly chemicals.
We tried everything that we could possibly eat. Pieces of leather, pieces of shoes, pieces of wood, even hair gel, but there was nothing.
4 of the survivors eventually ventured out to try to find the tail of the plane and any unfound luggage. They chose to look for the tail because it contained the missing battery that they needed to be able to communicate for help. But after just an hour of expedition and almost no progress, they had to turn around and head to the camp. When they returned, they talked about what they would be willing to do to save themselves if help never arrived. Carlito, one of the boys, mentioned that Nando said earlier about eating the pilots, and that he thinks he had gone crazy. But by Carlito's surprise, the boys state that Nando is not crazy because they had been thinking the same thing.
We were very hungry. The hunger of 10 days is the hunger that you know that if you don't eat, you are lost.
A few days without food, and now Nando is lying with his sister and had not left her side since he woke up from the coma. He soon realized that his sister had passed away in his arms. Her body has grown still. And he claims after that heart-wrenching moment, he needed to save all the energy he had left to use it and try to save the others. He states that he told himself not to cry because if he did, he would lose salt from the tears. And he needed every bit of energy that he had and could be used. At that moment, Nando was forced to become a survivor, and he would do whatever it took to survive.
The only thing that comforted me was that she died peacefully in my arms, and she wasn't alone. After my sister died, I felt a change, a very important change. There was an inner voice that was instinct or heart or will, I don't know how to describe it, that told me I have to go on. You have to move forward. You cannot cry. You can't destroy yourself morally or emotionally. You have to fight to survive.
After Nando's sister perished, there are now 27 survivors that still remain, with a few of the passengers not following too far behind the deceased. It has now been 9 days since the crash. 27 people remain and are living in the wreckage. One of the boys ended up finding a camera and began to document their daily life in the Andes. Two of the boys are sitting outside the plane listening to the radio when all of a sudden a gut-wrenching message cuts across the airwaves. To their disbelief, they heard that the search for Flight 571 had been called off and will continue the search in the spring due to the harsh weather conditions. For the first time in their young adult lives, they felt alone, abandoned, and afraid. For Nando, the news is a turning point. Team Captain Marcelo finally broke. He put his head in his hands, and he began to cry. Even though the search was over, doesn't mean that it was over for the remaining family members of the passengers. One of the boys' father never gave up hope. In fact, after the search was called off, he still continued to search. He began to go as far as to ride horseback to the inner western edges of the Andes Mountains to continue the search on his own. Amazing.
Carlos Paez refuses to give up his personal quest to find his son Carlitos. He travels from village to village, asking anyone he meets if they have seen signs of a plane crash.
Señor. ¿Cuántos kilómetros son? Ya. 1,5 kilómetros, me dijo.
Amazingly enough, he did not know that he was just a few miles away from the valley where the fuselage
His
sits.
search makes him a legend in the region.
That's when we started hearing, there goes that crazy old man who's still looking for his son that's lost in the mountains.
The boys were behind disbelief, and their faith and hope had been demolished. Optimism had made Marcelo the group's leader, but after the chilling news, he was all but useless to the group. As the boys looked around at each other, they realized that they were thinking about the same thing. They could not keep going without any food. The land around the crash site had no vegetation or animals at that altitude, so hunting and foraging was not an option. Even if they had a chance to, their bodies were in too much of a weakened state to do so. Their bodies were beginning to shut down, and they weren't moving as much. It came to the point that instead of going outside the fuselage to relieve their bodily functions, they began to use the rugby balls that they have been using for the severely injured. With nothing to sustain them, it would only be a matter of time before they all would die of starvation. They all knew that if they waited too long to eat, that they would be too weak to survive. And they were also aware that the bodies of the deceased passengers lay preserved in the packed snow not far from the fuselage. It didn't take long for them to realize that in order to survive, there was only one option left.
Carlitos looked into my eyes and said, "Nando, why are you thinking the same thing that I'm thinking?" And I said, "How can you know what I'm thinking?" And he said, "Because everybody must be thinking the same thing."
There's no food, only water. The only way to survive is to have the bodies.
Most difficult part is Of course, the repugnance you feel to someone dead and having to eat a dead person is horrible. But at the same time, I thought I have to do this if I want to stay alive.
To stay alive, they would have to use the bodies of their dead friends and family members as food. Some of the boys are disgusted, but yet understanding at the thought. And some are shocked and can't get past the idea of gorging themselves on human flesh. Most of the survivors were devoted Catholics, and they argued that it is a sin to eat human flesh. But as a Christian, Canessa argues that it would go against God's will not to eat. It would be like committing suicide, and it was his duty for them to stay alive. He claims that when Christ died, he gave his body to use that we could have spiritual life, and that the dead passenger souls were already in heaven, and what was left was an empty vessel. He also went as far as to say that the dead would want them to eat their lifeless bodies. Most of the survivors saw what he was trying to say. They knew that if they died, they would want their friends to eat their bodies to stay alive. Some of the survivors prayed to God, asking for guidance. And there was plenty of discussion among the team. Starvation led to action. As the medical student, Canessa knew that the human tissue contained proteins and fats. Later in the afternoon, Zambino, Canessa, and 2 other survivors went forth to do the emotional, physical, and unthinkable act of cutting the bodies. But as the 4 boys approached the bodies, they could not do the job that they had tasked themselves to do, to save the others from having to commit the task themselves. Alone, Canessa went into the snow. He undertook the decision of whose body to cut the meat from. Out of the 10 remains they had lying in the snow, the survivors deemed 3 of them off limits: Nando's mother and sister and a nephew of an older teammate. The experience for the survivors was, needless to say, unbelievably stressful. Canessa used a shard of glass collected from one of the windows to slice into the first body. Years later, he stated, "It was the last step in our transformation, the final goodbye to innocence. And I will never forget that first incision. The first meat was taken out of someone's buttocks that had been sticking out of the snow. Canessa cut out matchstick-sized pieces for the boys to eat. The flesh was difficult to cut because it was frozen, so he put pieces of meat on top of the fuselage to dry out in the sun. A few hours later, Canessa told those assembled in the plane that the meat is ready and that they should eat, but nobody moved. So, to lead by example, he picked up a strip of flesh, hesitated momentarily, and then stuck it in his mouth and swallowed. Slowly, one by one, the others followed. Each survivor took a piece, forcing themselves to consume it. Every survivor except for a few, they denied this action. But eventually hunger set in, and they could not deny the act any longer. Thus began the quiet acceptance of cannibalism. Nobody asked for this, nobody wanted it, but it had to be done in order to survive.
Alberto Canessa was very important because he was a medical student, and he said, if we want to survive, we have to do it. And you have to be in that place, at that moment, in that position, with that fear, that feeling of abandonment, to understand that decision.
Technically speaking, what the survivors did was not considered cannibalism per se. The term usually refers to a devious means in order to consume a person. What the survivors have done was entirely something else. They realized the severity of the situation and vowed to make it a sacred act. Later written, Canessa talked about the mental barrier that he encountered when he tried to eat his friends. Eventually, after consuming the frozen bodies, the survivors claimed that it became easier over time to accept the fact that they were eating human meat to stay alive. Time in the Andes caused this to become a daily routine, and as time went on, it became a part of normal behavior. Later that night, they all gathered in the fuselage. They began to promise each other that if any of them would die, then they would like their bodies to be eaten for survival. Over the next few days, the boys settled into a pattern of survival. Sometimes they was even able to make a small fire using wood that they had found in the fuselage and paper money for fuel. Because the harsh sun is burning their skin, a few of the boys paint their faces with lipstick and makeup that they had found in the woman's handbags. The other boys teased them, saying that they looked like prostitutes, asking how much would they charge, and continuing that each of the makeup applied boys would go broke because they was ugly prostitutes. Although this didn't seem like much to some, or even offensive to others, this comedic behavior lifted the boys' spirits. It was a night just like any other night. The survivors was bundled up in the fuselage trying to stay warm from each other's body heat and a few covers that they have created over time. The dim light of the late afternoon brought a vibration that rattled the fuselage and concerned the remaining survivors. Before anyone could react, an avalanche tears down the mountainside and fills the plain with snow. Those who are laying down is buried as soon as the snow rushes in. The survivors described the experience as having 100 tons of concrete poured on top of them. They couldn't move. They couldn't breathe. One of the boys just happened to be standing up at the exact moment of the avalanche. He is the only one left unburied, and he begins to dig furiously for his friends. He uncovers one of the teammates, and the boys start digging together for anyone else they could find with their last few minutes of air running out. Each person found was added to the small enclosed search and rescue. 8 more passengers perished under their snowy grave. And the list of the recently deceased includes Marcelo, the team's captain, and Liliana Method, the mother figure to the boys. The oxygen was quickly running out with every panicked breath being taken. Quickly thinking, Nando took a hammock pole and a lighter and poked a hole in the ceiling of the fuselage so that the boys could breathe. It took a suffocating few hours, but the boys managed to claw their way through 3 feet of snow that has been followed by a fierce blizzard. They had no choice but to wait it out. There was now only 19 survivors left. They had to now deal with the freezing weather with no blankets, no cushions, trapped inside a fuselage that is now acting as an icebox. The boys became trapped for 3 days until the storm eventually passed. Since the corpses that they had been feeding on was outside the fuselage, they had no choice and was forced to cut the meat from the recently deceased from inside the plane. They had to eat their friends that was just alive moments ago. The bodies of their friends that they had just been talking to before the avalanche. There was no way to cook the meat, so they had to eat it wet and raw.
The avalanche was an important part of the story, more than you can think. The mountain was definitely trying to kill us one by one, and this increased my desire to leave as quickly as possible.
Those that died and was left inside the plane were placed into a frozen wall of ice. They have also left some separated arms and legs in the cockpit just in case they suffered another avalanche. In an interview with National Geographic, Canessa later reflects on the integrity of the survivors. He says that you get very smart when you are dying. The boys continued with their daily routines, and for Nando and Canessa, the avalanche was the last straw. Their only shot at survival was to have one or more persons hike out to the mountains, find either the tail of the plane with the missing batteries, and or venture out further and find civilization.
We were obsessed with finding the airplane's tail because that's where all the luggage was, and also the batteries to power the plane's radio.
4 of the strongest members were chosen for the expedition. Nando, Canessa, a boy with the nickname Tintin, and another unlucky survivor named Uma. Nando decides that their best bet was to head west, despite unknowingly understanding and underestimating just how far the dangers of the trip would be.
Nando believes that only one mountain stands between him and safety.
Chile. Chile was to the west, and if we climbed that mountain, we would be saved.
They were all learning that humans can adjust to almost anything. The 4 strongest had been chosen for their strength and will to do anything to survive. 34 days after the crash, the 4 boys that had been chosen planned out their expedition before just heading out into the middle of nowhere. They know that they needed to travel west, but the mountains to the west were so daunting that they decided to go east down the valley and then circle back around. They headed out with the wind at their backs and the sun at their face, everyone having high hopes that the attempt would be successful. They headed out at the early hours of the morning at 7 a.m. But by 10 a.m., the hikers had been spotted coming back to the camp down the mountain. The reason being, it started snowing again, which made going out at this time impossible and dangerous.
Todo era en contra nuestra.
Everything was against us. We were walking in snow waist deep, struggling because of the lack of oxygen and because we were so weak, and the cold. Unimaginable. Human beings cannot imagine how unbearable it was.
The boys are frozen, exhausted, and defeated.
Over the next few days, the hikers were given the privilege for preparing for the expedition. The other survivors felt that it would be best for the hikers to be at tip-top shape for their trip. This meant getting rest and sleeping as much as they could, eat as much as they could, and refrain from any labor work, all in hopes to build up their strength and get help. 2 other survivors took control of the meat and control of the group. 2 days later, they were ready to leave again, but halfway into their trip, due to an injury, the hiking team were already down a 3rd man. The boy who recently got injured, Uma, had to turn around because his leg wound started to become infected. He turned around and hiked back to the fuselage as the other boys continued their trip. Despite the misfortune incident, the trip had started off great. Finally, 36 days of suffering, just 2 hours later, they came to a crest, and lo and behold, it was the long-lost tail of the plane. Finding the tail of the plane was like Christmas for the boys. The discovery offered a little bit of hope and comfort. They found warm clothes, food, rum, Coca-Cola, toothpaste, which one of the boys was extremely excited to eat, comic books, and tons of cartons of cigarettes. And the most exciting item of them all, the batteries. Compared to how they have been living, that night was like staying at a luxury hotel. They put extra clothes on the floor, barricaded the doors to block the cold air from entering, and they were able to stretch out on the floor and read comic books before going to sleep. They tore out the upholstery and sewed it together into a sleeping bag, a large enough size to fit all 3 boys. The next morning, the boys continued their expedition, but eventually finding themselves before a huge mountain, and Canessa begins to worry. When exactly would they be able to turn around and go west again? That night, they attempted to sleep outside of the tail of the plane in the open mountain range, training to test the climates. And they did this by digging a hole in the snow and sleeping in there for the night. By the next morning, they decided not to continue on because they would not survive another night like that. Nando insists that they keep going, but Canessa held firm on his opinion and argued that if they died, then where would the other boys be? They decided to go back to the carnage of the tail, hang out for a few days, rest up, and then return to the fuselage with the supplies they had found. When the 3 men were spotted coming down from the mountain to the fuselage, everyone knows that not enough time had gone by for them to have been able to locate and bring back help. Although cheerful and joyful over the extra supplies, they all faced a new problem. Now the 3 hikers would have to haul the radio back up to the tail to reunite it with the magic batteries. Nando and Canessa had to pry and remove the part of the radio that was embedded in their dead pilot's chest. Lack of equipment was a huge problem that they still faced. They had rugby boots, but no warm socks. And remember, some of the passengers had never seen snow before the crash. So the survivors made their own socks out of the skin and fat from the elbows of the recently deceased. Also, the expeditioners, neither of whom had any hiking experience or hiking equipment. A few days passes, and the 3 explorers are able to reunite the radio with the magic batteries, only to find out that it was dead.
We didn't have the knowledge, the capacity, the gear. We didn't know how to make it work. We just had hope. It was going to be a miracle if it worked. I sincerely think that in the end, nobody expected that radio to work.
They couldn't radio out, although they did pick up a bulletin saying that the search of the flight has been resumed. The news at this point was not as exciting as one might think. The boys realized that they weren't looking for survivors, but that they were looking for dead bodies. The search team was taking photos of the area, but it could still take weeks to develop the film. By the time the rescue team figured out where the survivors were, then they might really be only dead bodies to find.
In village after village, Carlos posts a cash reward for any news about a crash site and the whereabouts of his son Carlitos.
Estoy tratando de encontrar información sobre el avión que se perdió. ¿Se los pasan a su papá?
I felt like a postman, bringing news from place to place. I knew that the more people that were worried about the lost plane, the sooner we would find it.
By late November, the bodies that they had been storing buried in the snow had started to rot due to the seasonal warmer sun. Canessa encouraged people to eat parts of the bodies that they normally would discard or ignore. Stating claim that the kidneys and liver were full of nutrients. Layers of fat was all cut from the bodies and laid out to dry. Once the fat formed a crust, everyone ate it. They also began to eat the parts of the bodies that they normally would discard or throw to the side, like hands, feet, and tongues. Someone even ate some testicles. They always tried to eat all of the corpse before eating the next body. Nando quickly gained favor with the group as both leader and expeditioner. His determination and will to find help inspired the boys, and he wasn't prone to anger or impatience like Canessa.
I had chosen December 12th to leave, because if you do not choose a date, you stay and stay. I told Roberto, we have to leave, because if we wait too long, we will become too weak to escape from here.
As time grew close for another expedition, the boys began to prepare for the task at hand. The three boys took parts of the plane and created a bigger, better sleeping bag for the trip. This time, it would be highly insulated and it would protect them from the cold. They took some insulation from the rear of the fuselage, some copper wire, and waterproof fabric that they found from the air conditioners. It was sewn together using cartilage for the knee.
The preparation for the final expedition was a lot of teamwork, spectacular teamwork. Everyone gave it their best shot so we could be successful. Carlitos was in charge of sewing a sleeping bag with copper thread that we got from electrical material from the airplane.
They used the glare shield from the cockpit to make sunglasses for Nando and Roberto to protect them from snow blindness. To carry the supply of human flesh and water they will need, clothes are converted into knapsacks.
Some gave their best clothes so that we could fight the cold. Everybody knew that this was the last chapter in our story. The expedition would prevail, or it was death for all of us.
They also used seat cushions for the snowshoes and a metal pole as a walking stick. By now, some of the survivors' health is at high risk, and their bodies are starting to fail. As the body begins to shut down, the mind starts to wonder. One of the boys becomes delusional and convinced that there is an escape hatch somewhere in the plane. He tells the other boys that he is going to the store, and upon returning, he will provide Coca-Cola and food. He even went as far as to ask anyone else if they had any special requests. Jokingly, the boys buy into his fantasy, telling him what to get from the store. The weather and the other survivors pressure the expeditioners to leave, but Canessa insists that the sleeping bag that they have been preparing was not ready yet. The boys make accusations that Canessa was just scared of leaving. Tension begins to run high through the aircraft.
But the victims' families put pressure on the government in Uruguay to send up a special surveillance plane. High over the mountains, the plane's camera records an unmistakably human sign. A cross. The photos are developed at the Chilean Air Force Base. Jorge Massa and Carlos Paez examine the photos.
Look, this is a cross. This is a cross in the snow.
It's true. We've never seen a cross there before.
This is a sign that the boys are alive.
But the next day, Commander Massa receives some new and disappointing information about the origin of the cross.
After speaking to officials in Argentina, we discovered that, unfortunately, the cross was actually made of instruments used to measure snow levels that would tell us how much water to expect in the summer.
The cross in the photos is not the one the boys have built. Once again, the rescue mission is called off.
Day 61. 2 months after the plane crash. Within this time, 3 more people had perished. The team's kicker, Rafael, the boy with the flayed calf, and Yuma, one of the original 4 picked out for the expedition, all had succumbed to their injuries. Their wounds had become infected, and they contracted gangrene. Yuma, one of the original 4 chosen for the expedition, had succumbed to his injuries, and he died just 10 days before the survivors were rescued. Only 16 survivors remain, and time was running out. The explorers had no other choice. They couldn't wait any longer. So they packed socks full of human meat as their main food source. And before leaving, Nando takes one of the appointed leaders that will remain behind with the group, and he tells them that if they need to eat his mother and sister's bodies for food, then they have his permission.
Not only did Nando have the courage to climb the biggest mountain in the world, he had the courage and nobility to authorize us to feed from the most sacred thing he had, his mother and sister.
I thought to myself that Carlitos doesn't know how scared I am, or that I don't know where I'm going. I don't have the slightest idea, and I said, look, this could be very difficult, and we may not return.
The 3 explorers use human skin to act as extra protection against the weather. This was it. The time was now. No more planning around. It was all or nothing, a matter of life and death. The 3 explorers take their first step of their unknown miles journey. They are weighed down with supplies and wearing as many clothing items as possible. They set out up the side of the valley, headed northwest. The climb was hard, and the extra weight caused them to sink into the melting snow. The explorers fought desperately against the altitude sickness, snow blindness, and sheer exhaustion, reaching a nearly 17,000-foot summit in 3 days, a trip that was originally estimated to take 1 full day. The other survivors could actually see the trio climbing the mountain from the fuselage, and they were fully aware of just how long the trip was taking.
What I remember most while we were climbing was my breath, how I had to breathe before I moved another step.
The air is much thinner. Every breath that Nando takes has much less oxygen than at sea level. This reduces blood flow to the heart and muscles. Eventually, the restricted blood flow can cause brain fluids to leak inside the skull. The brain begins to swell. If left untreated, the results can be fatal.
You close your mind to everything that is not of that moment. I was totally concentrating on the next step, where I was going to put my feet, my hand. My whole life was planning the next 10 or 15 meters, and then the next 10. It was a constant flow of short intervals. If I had thought about what was ahead, I never would have made it. And I think that the constant flow hid the physical pain.
3 days after setting off, they finally reached the top of the mountain, hoping to get a better understanding of where they are at and where to go further. They fully expected to see the green landscapes of Brazil on the other side, but much to their surprise and disbelief, instead of the green valleys of Chile, the only sight that awaited them was just even more mountains. The heart-crushing scene was enough to make anyone lose hope.
We thought we were going to climb the mountain in 1 day, and then see the valleys of Chile, or the lights of a city. But it wasn't what we thought. It was much bigger and much more difficult. After climbing that mountain, I realized that everything we thought was wrong. We weren't in the foothills. We were in the middle of a mountain chain. There was no chance of surviving. Absolutely no chance. It was the most decisive moment of my life. I accepted that I was going to die in those mountains. I was not going to return to that plane. But dying up here seemed useless.
As Canessa collapsed in devastation, Nando points to 2 mountains where the snow looked thinner. Even though he believed that it will take them 50 days to get there, he tells Canessa that they must head that direction. He believed that if they followed the valley down to the Y-shaped terrain, then there would be a fork-shaped leadway, and that would lead them to civilization, and they would be saved. Since the trip was taking longer than expected, Nando and Canessa decides to send Tintin back to the fuselage and take over his food supply, a life-changing choice that would obviously come into play. They begin to set off on their long, miserable process. They walked, climbed, crossed crevices, glaciers, rivers, and much more. At night, they endured sub-zero temperatures, and that makes it hard to sleep, causing lack of rest. Now 7 days into their expedition, Nando and Canessa turn a corner and suddenly find themselves at a place where the snow ends. Back at the crash site, the boys that remain continue their daily routines, but start to give up hope because the trip has taken 3 times as long as they estimated. 70 days after the crash, 9 days into the expedition, the boys have now walked 40 miles through some of the most roughest terrain in the Andes. At this point, Canessa's health was not very good. He becomes so weak that he can barely walk. 10 days into the expedition, the 2 boys end up walking another 4 miles over rough and difficult landscape with only their instincts to guide them. Eventually, the boys stumble upon a small stream, and they begin to follow it until it becomes a wider river. They spot a cow and evidence that people had been camping in the area. The stream was the first fresh water that they had seen in 2 months. And around the stream, they saw grass growing, and Canessa grabbed a bunch and stuffed it in his mouth and began to chew. There was grass, moss, birds, and they also stumbled upon a horseshoe, axe marks, and empty soup cans. As night approached and began to set in, Nando begins to search for wood to make a fire, when all of a sudden he sees a man riding a horse just feet away from the other side of the river. The moment Nando saw the man was the first time since the crash that he felt safe. Nando and Canessa was estimated to have walked 15,260 feet up and down through some of the most dangerous terrain known to man, and they achieved this goal without any hiking experience or any hiking gear to guide them along the way. The man that was spotted across the river is a Chilean shepherd who was herding his flock through the mountains. Nando quickly gathered what any strength he had left and yells for help, shouting and waving his arms into the air like a madman. And the boys try yelling for help, but it was no use. Their weakened state and mild voices could not carry past the sounds of the rushing river. As the shepherd spots the boys, he assumes that the ragged-looking young men are a pair of lost hunters. With no way of communication and night approaching fast, the man signals that he will come back the next day. He shouts a single word, tomorrow. He throws the boys some small pieces of bread and disappeared into the distance. He approached the river carrying a rock, with a piece of paper tied around it with a string and a pencil. He threw the rock to the boys across the river. Nando uses the pencil and the paper and begins to write a note. He states that, "I come from a plane that fell into these mountains. We've been walking for 10 days, and I have a friend up here who is injured. In the plane, there are still 14 survivors, and we don't know how long they have left. We don't have any food, and we're weak. When are you going to come fetch us out? Please, we can't even walk. Where are we?" The boys throw the rock with the note across the river to the man, and the man puts the note in his pocket, jumped on his horse, and once again ran off into the distance, only this time, hopefully returning with help. The journey takes him a full day to find the help that the boys need. By the next morning, Nando and Canessa are greeted by military and rescue workers on horseback. They carefully escort the injured and weakened 2 boys to a nearby rescue station, and at this point, it was nearly dark. There was nothing that the rescue workers could do but to retire for the evening and postpone the search once again. December 25th, 74 days after the crash, 13 days into the expedition, the news spreads throughout South America. The rescue helicopter is notified and begins the search thanks to a map provided, hand-drawn by Nando, and the press heads towards the foothills to see if the rumors are true. They have walked all night to get their first glance at the survivors. Nando and Canessa remembers that the reporters had quite a struggle climbing up the rescue area. They had mud up to their waists and had ripped their clothing along the way. Nando and Canessa are just finishing breakfast when the questioning starts to pour in.
Y en el momento del accidente ya se desprendió parte del avión, con lo cual parte de nuestros compañeros ya desaparecieron y no los volvimos a ver nunca más. muertos en el accidente hubieron aproximadamente 4 o 5 personas. Muchos heridos bastante graves que ya la primera noche fallecieron. Prácticamente ilesos hubieron dos o tres compañeros que fueron los que nos ayudaron con los heridos. El primer día fue un día agotador realmente porque tuvimos que sacar los heridos que estaban trancados entre los asientos y entre los fierros y acomodarlos como pudiéramos, y era un día que nevaba mucho y hacía mucho frío. Es decir, que el primer día quedamos exhaustos hasta que nos cayó la noche y la noche seguía así entre los lamentos de los heridos. El primer día fue trágico.
Dinos, ¿qué mensaje podrías entregarle tú en este momento a tus padres? ¿Qué le dirías tú ahora?
A mi padre, que uno de los pensamientos fundamentales que me mantuvo vivo durante dos meses fue tratar de verlo de nuevo, ya que sé que en este momento me va a estar precisando y yo a él mucho, ¿no? Que pronto espero estar con él.
¿Cuántos familiares tienes tú? ¿Tienes más hermanos?
Tenía a mi madre y a mi hermana que lamentablemente fallecieron en el avión y me queda otra hermana.
Roberto, ¿tú habías pensado alguna vez que podrías pasar esta Navidad con tus familiares?
Bueno, esa era la mayor ilusión nuestra y con eso nos engañábamos un poco y nos evadíamos pensando en pasar Navidad con la familia. Solamente la fe en Dios fue lo que nos mantuvo unidos así para pasar esta Navidad. Yo realmente mandarles el mensaje de tranquilidad de que estoy perfectamente bien, ya me alcanza para pasar bien la Navidad.
Sí, estamos perfectamente bien, que no se preocupen, y los 14 compañeros también están muy bien.
Por aquí tenemos al arriero, a este chilenazo que cruza a menudo la cordillera con su ganado y que fue el primer hombre que pudo tomar contacto con los sobrevivientes del avión. Cuéntenos cómo fue ese momento. ¿A dónde iba usted?
Yo venía caminando, primero cuando yo los vi, iba a juntar el ganado. Después, pero yo pensé que era gente que andaba turisteando, ¿no? Después cuando ya los veo que se aproximan corriendo, que corrían y se caían para acercarse a donde ya podían gritarme a mí. Entonces vine yo, me paré y me hacían con las manos, pero yo no lo entendía.
Back at the fuselage, the 14 boys that remain on the mountain wake up and they turn on the radio. And they hear that their friends have made it to safety and help is on its way. The boys are shocked and overjoyed at the exciting news. They begin to prep and prepare for the rescue. Some comb their hair, some try to find better clothing, some rinse their face off with the snow to get the dirt off, and some even go to great lengths to shave their beards with shards of glass. The 2 boys answered all the questions, but left out all the gruesome details that they had to do in order to survive. As the Air Force doctor began to examine Nando and Canessa, one of the pilots had returned with an empty chopper. He explains to Nando that he will need his help to find the wreckage of the plane, and he directs the pilot to his friends. Still to this day, Nando claims that he has no idea how he even stepped foot in the aircraft heading back to the crash site.
I don't want to go on that helicopter. I mean, I'm saved. I don't want to fly on anything again. Any flying machine I want it far away from me. I don't know how I found myself strapped on that helicopter
But the pattern of bad news isn't finished just quite yet. The rescue team approaches the boys, but the helicopter only has room for half of the survivors. 6 of the boys that are in the weakest stages climb aboard the chopper. The pilot promises to return later. As the helicopter lifts off, it battles thin air, heavy winds, which sparks PTSD for some of the boys in it. A small team of medics stay behind with the remaining boys. Due to weather conditions, the rescue mission had to wait yet again, continuing it the next morning. The medics tend and take care of the 8 boys that have been left back at the crash site. Upon entering the early hours of December 26th, a full 75 days after the crash, the last 8 survivors are rescued. All 16 boys, severely underweight, but had no serious injuries.
Carlos Paez has been told that his son Carlitos is among the survivors. But after his epic 10-week search, he hardly dares believe it.
There was a lot of anguish while waiting for the helicopter. When it landed and the dust settled, I saw Carlitos. He smelled of sweat and sacrifice and death. I hugged him intensely. I think that photo of us shows that moment very well, because it conveys the horror and the happiness at the same time.
By 3 p.m., the survivors are rushed to the hospital. Nando and Canessa are already there, waiting for the boys. As the boys get to the hospital, they all embrace, falling to the ground from the state of weakness. At first, the survivors explain an explanation of what they had to do in order to survive. Honestly, they didn't look like people who had been starving to death in the mountains for the past 2 months. As Nando begins to walk in the hospital behind his friends, he was told to turn around and leave. An officer told him, "You can't go in there, that's for survivors only." The boys didn't look like they had been starving. "But I am a survivor," responds Nando. So finally, the boys had to give an explanation to the doctor on how they had been able to survive this whole time. The shock is too much for the doctor, and he rushes to tell the priest and authorities. The newspapers across South America published the gruesome and graphic photos of the body parts near the plane, explaining to everyone how the survivors had actually survived, and how they had to eat the flesh of their dead teammates. The boys fear that the world will believe the worst, meaning that they killed each other in order to survive. And they wanted to make sure that the public heard their side of the story before anyone cast judgment. The rescue made all the headlines across the world, but reactions quickly shifted from joyous relief and amazement to shock and disgust. Troubling enough, the church took issue with the survivors' actions. The boys arrive at a college where they had agreed to give statements at a press conference for newspapers from around the world. Each survivor speaks, telling a different part of the story. They all express their own hesitations about their actions and describe it as a supernatural battle that ensured over the decision. They explain that eating their friends was not done out of hateful behavior or violence, but it was an act of compassion for survival.
Llegó ese momento en el cual ya no teníamos alimentos ni cosas por el estilo. Y nosotros pensamos, si Jesús en la última cena repartió su cuerpo y sangre a todos sus apóstoles, ahí nos estaba dando a entender que nosotros debíamos hacer lo mismo, tomar tu cuerpo y sangre, que se había encarnado. Y eso, que fue una comunión íntima entre todos nosotros, fue lo que nos ayudó a subsistir. Y fue una entrega a cada uno. Nosotros no queremos que esto, que es para nosotros una cosa íntima, sea ni manoseada ni tocada, cosa por el estilo. Pero debe ser interpretado y tomado en su real dimensión. Y tienen que pensar en todo lo grande que fueron aquellos muchachos.
The survivors braced themselves for judgment and horror from the Catholic Church, medical professionals, and loved ones, the family of the deceased, and the rest of the world. But when they finished their statements, the audience burst into applause. Across the board, people offered them understanding and forgiveness. Even the parents of those the survivors ate offered compassion. A father of one of the dead boys stated, "We are grateful that there was 45 of them because this helped at least 16 return." A priest came to take the survivors to confession, and he spoke with the boys for hours. The church deemed that the boys had done nothing wrong. In fact, if they didn't eat their friends, then they would have committed a form of suicide. The church told the world that no sin had been committed since they hadn't killed anyone, but only done what they had to do in order to survive. The survivors were relieved and largely considered heroes. Canessa set out to meet the parents and family members of the deceased. He took them the letters that their loved ones have written during the last days. And still to this day, most of the survivors still live in their hometown, and they still remain close. Together, they've even made the long, hard journey back to the crash site to visit the mountain where their friends' graves still lie, even creating a memorial for the deceased friends. Relatives of whose bodies that were used for food say that they had no ill will toward those who survived, and the survivors feel that their dead friends live on in spirit. And 40 years later, after the crash site, the team finally got to play the missed match that they never got to play against the Chilean team.
Todas estas personas aquí. Podemos levantar un impresionante, hicimos una misa también cerca de los haitianos, en un campamento que teníamos. Y bueno, más o menos.
As of January 11, 2024, out of all 16 survivors, 14 are still alive and doing well. The number of immediate family members are at 140 family members and continues adding more. Several of the survivors have written books about the horrifying ordeal, and their stories have inspired many. They say history is written by the victors. Human history involving mankind is never set in stone. Information including scrolls, statues, and religious artifacts could all end up being just a small footnote in time as the future becomes the now. We have seen these acts erase historic events in just seconds right before our very eyes. Whether the reasoning being due to war, natural disasters wiping out whole civilizations without a trace, government weaponized machines like controlling and manipulating the weather, or just something as simple as destruction caused by an organized terrorist group. It has always been, and will continue to be, way too easy for an organized group of people to conspire, go into an area with a pre-existing civilization, take over that land, fight, capture, enslave, and or kill the current civilization. Then take all the past and present history like scrolls, statues, artifacts, and religious relics, throw them into a hole to be buried and later forgotten about with the passing of time. A lot of history could be destroyed by men laying down their lives for a better life. Whether you are on the winning side or losing side, history is written with blood, sweat, and tears, which would set the roots to a new foundation, covered, hidden, and disguised with secrets, lies, cover-ups, and murder. All reasons to begin to rewrite history. And since history repeats itself, I'm sure we will continue to see these acts carried out with the future events to come.
We find ourselves is due to our own actions or inactions. Because it is our own fault, we are the only ones who can change future events. Education seems to me to be a major part of the solution. The remaining part is the abolition of secrecy. Through ignorance or misplaced trust, we as a people have abdicated our role as the watchdog of our government. If we had done our jobs as citizens, we would never have reached this point. Most of us are completely ignorant as to even the most basic functions of our government. We have truly become a nation of sheep.
Well, I didn't know that.